Well, that really kicks us off well for our next session, the Senator's comments about the capabilities that veterans bring to these national security and energy security issues as they transition from the military into civilian life. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for our fourth session this afternoon, Sandra Purohit, who is going to be moderating a panel on bringing the military to civilian career transition across the Energy Center. Sandra, take it away.
Thanks so much. Yep, I'm Sandra Purohit, Director of Federal Advocacy at E2, Environmental Entrepreneurs. We're a non-partisan, non-profit group of about 10,000 business leaders, happy to say including many great veterans, some in the audience today. We are a group that advocates for sound environmental and economic policy. And as part of that advocacy, we have been tracking the energy sector, and particularly the clean energy sector, for about a decade. And a couple of things in that analysis keep coming up. One of them is that the energy sector is much better at hiring veterans than other parts of the economy. This was most recently pulled out by a Department of Energy report, the JERA report that showed where veterans represent about 5% of the workforce nationally, it's about 9% in the energy sector, so almost twice as much. The other thing that we found in E2's data and tracking is that there's about to be a whole lot more opportunity. This is probably not news to everybody, but we're seeing, if you go to e2.org/announcements, you'll see some 340 clean energy projects, massive projects, think multi-million-dollar investments in factories across the country, $130 billion in private sector investment, 100,000 jobs being created already. In this last year, our Clean Jobs America report showed that for clean energy jobs, every clean energy sector, jobs grew at a rate at least twice as fast as the national economy. So that's sort of the setting and why I'm so excited that we're having this conversation today. And I'm also excited to be having it with a great group of veterans because the numbers are awesome, but the reality of what this looks like is where we're really going to metal meets the road. No, rubber meets the road. So with that, let me make sure I introduce everybody properly. And I'm going to start with Kevin. Kevin Doffing is a U.S. Army veteran and currently director of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project here at the Atlantic Council. He's the founder of Project Vanguard, a grassroots advocacy group of veterans supporting renewable energy. We then have Mary King, also an Army veteran. Mary is now Executive Vice President and Chief People Officer at Invenergy. They're a US-based multinational power generation company. Invenergy develops, builds, owns, and operates power generation and energy storage projects here and around the world. And then Steve O'Rourke, a Navy veteran and Chief Executive Officer of JERA America, the US subsidiary of the largest power generation company in Japan. JERA provides reliable energy for Japan, the US, and around the world, and advances technologies for a low-carbon future globally. With that introduction, I'm going to jump right in and ask you each to speak a little bit about your journey from military life to civilian life and why energy. Why don't we start with you?
Oh, sure. So when I left the military, I just did what all the older boys did. I went through a headhunter, which was a great experience, got me into corporate America, where I learned I was not a great fit, and found myself in a riff about 3 months after I got there. So I kind of had to start figuring out, what do I want to do when I grow up right now? And it turned out that entrepreneurship was the path for me. So I moved back to Houston, I bought an oilfield supply company, and started digging in there, and a few years in, realized I missed being around a lot of other veterans. That's why I enjoy being the director here. I get to just hang out with other vets. It just so happens that they are usually matriculating up into higher decision-making levels, so it's good for business. But it's just been trying to figure out what I didn't know. And with 200,000 veterans leaving a year, everybody's trying to figure out the same thing.
Mary?
So I transitioned from the military. I didn't do what I guess the guys did. I didn't get an executive recruiter. I don't know. I missed that one. My husband and I were both serving, and when we transitioned out of the military, he was providing end-of-life care for his father. And I looked around. We needed to be in Indianapolis, and I felt so fortunate to have a chance to work at the regulated utility. When I tell this story now, I say it's because infrastructure is essential. I'm not 100% sure that Mary King wasn't just saying, well, they wear boots, I wear boots, this could work. But there is something about infrastructure and making a difference that started me in energy and kept me in energy for the next 20 years.
Yeah, I guess, so when I left the military, I was in the Navy and I drove submarines for a while. And when I left, I ended up with about 7 job offers, right? 6 of them were energy companies and 1 was not. And I chose the one that was not. So I ended up going into the semiconductor industry straight out of the military, and this was out in Silicon Valley way back when, far more years than I'm willing to admit. And as luck would have it, what you realize, I think, when you leave the military and get into the private sector is you probably have a lot more skills that are applicable than you realize you have. And when you start to apply these skills within the private sector, you find out that, well, yeah, things are different, but you actually, in some respects, even have a leg up on a lot of folks that happen to be there and have come through, let's say, a normal civilian path coming through. And we could talk about those as we go through this discussion over time, but as luck would have it, I spent time in the semiconductor industry, I did a startup company, I spent time on Wall Street, of all things, and then through a set of circumstances that will never repeat, I ended up in the energy industry. So I am now in the energy industry and have been here in one way, shape, or form for the past 12 years or so, 13 years or so. And I think it's a great place to be, right? But I guess the long and the short of it is you don't really know where you're going to end up and what path you're going to take. It's never really a direct line. It actually winds. And you kind of have to have a bit of patience to move through that a little bit.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, if we sort of get into this conversation, I guess we should probably start off with what is an energy job? Because we say that like it's one thing, but it couldn't be further from that. So any of you?
You're probably hiring the most.
Absolutely, you should all know. So Invenergy has probably 100 to 200 jobs posted today. We hire veterans overwhelmingly into 3 areas. We hire them into technical jobs, so a wind tech, a solar tech, a storage tech. We hire them into professional jobs, so IT, project manager, engineer, all of those type of jobs. And we hire them into leadership jobs. So the O&M manager, the leader of our regulatory affairs group, the leader of our marine affairs group, all of those areas are also areas where we are constantly looking for veteran backgrounds. So if I looked at the numbers this year, about 15% of all of our hires this year have been veterans. So we are actively looking. But I would say, important to so Invenergy is a company about a little over 2,500, 100 to 200 jobs. This year, year to date, we've gotten over 38,000 applicants. So it's a big pool that you're looking for when you're trying to move into corporate America. And it's important to have this kind of interaction, this kind of networking, this kind of reaching out to other people to really be successful.
So I would just say, to Mary's point, I think that there's 3 main pathways in. The technical role for junior enlisted, whether that's a technician or craft labor or skilled labor. The project management role. I talk to a lot of veterans that are, hey, should I go get my PMP? And the honest truth is if you think you need it. Because if you can't convince yourself that you're ready for the job, then you're not. And if you can convince yourself, you're more likely going to be able to convince an employer. But I've suffered through many conversations where I was overqualified but inexperienced. And that's a typical refrain for a lot of transitioning service members. Thank you for your service. Oh, you talk like my boss's boss. But this is an associate role, and you may have too big of ideas. So, tempering expectations, knowing that you're coming in. The CEO of Pepsi doesn't join the military and become a 4-star, but 4 stars often make really great executives immediately in corporate America. So, you have the opportunity to work up fast, but sometimes you do have to start over. The third role, and I think it's really critical for the development of energy in this sector, especially in the renewable pathway, is project development. The soft skills of being able to work with people, self-motivate, get after it, is a great launch pad for transitioning service members to get into the renewable energy industry.
Yeah, I'd say that you start with an industry, right? You think about an industry. We're talking about energy here, right? I came in through a different path and ended up in energy. And then you look at companies, and you take a look at the companies you might want to think about working at and do some research on them. And don't worry as much about the position yet. Once you find the companies or this buffet of companies you see, then you talk to them. And you can do that through recruiters. You can do that by calling companies directly. What I've often found is that when you have some former military that actually have direct inputs into companies and requests, oftentimes they are responded to, right? They're not ignored. And what does happen oftentimes in companies is things get ignored. Emails come in, you ignore them. But if it's right up front, former military, oftentimes that actually gets a look, right? And you bring people in and you talk to those people. Where do we hire? I would say it's across the gamut, and it really comes down to skill sets. I think project management, operations, engineering, of course, you see people in that. Our head of audit is former Army, right, as an example. We're growing pretty rapidly. We don't have an active program to recruit veterans, even though I'd like to put that in place, and we'll probably do that going forward, much more so than we have historically. But I think it's across the board. And you have some people that come out and go on to graduate school, for example, even if they get an MBA, they're finance, right? They can move into finance if they want. So it's really across the board. And we hire pretty much everywhere in the company.
And then on the flip side, why would you make the pitch to veterans? Why should they be considering the energy sector as a next career?
I mean, I feel like this is your next tour of duty. We've got work to be done, and this is a great place to do it. I'm an all-energy advocate, but I can tell you, being from Houston, working in oil and gas for most of my life, I mean, there's a different mentality, right? There's very much a growth mindset in the energy transition and clean energy, and everybody has come through different pathways into this, and the silos are not there that you can't kind of find your way in and move around, and so everybody's looking to help everybody else. And if you're trying to build a network, you should be before you apply for a job. So I would advocate that you should never apply for a job at a company if you haven't made a contact there. Otherwise, just being thrown in the ether. But once you can make a contact, especially at events like this, you have a huge leg up in the process.
I mean, I'll just, to that, veterans respond to veterans, without question. I mean, that's almost universal, I think.
Anything else to add? I mean, there's a lot of connection between national security and energy security. How would you weigh in on the notion of how is working in this space allowing you to advance both of those things? How is this your next tour?
So again, I mean, energy is one path. It's not the only path. When we look at energy, the way we look at it, right, is first it's about energy security. Then it's about affordability. And it's also about sustainability. There's a strong equivalence between energy security and national security. There's a strong equivalence between national security and international security. And I'm not saying people should come to the energy industry because they can further what they've been doing in the military, but understand the linkages, and your past in the military has a lot to say about how those linkages get applied. And when we think about those three things as sort of a triumvirate, energy security, affordability, and sustainability, energy security is an imperative, right? That has to happen. Affordability and sustainability are also absolutely necessary, but there's a nexus where they meet. And where they meet is what you have to optimize, because all three you have to do. But energy security is absolute.
I think that's right. I would add to that. We talked about when you're applying for jobs, go and learn about the company. That's absolutely true. But reach out, meet someone who's doing the job, meet someone at the company, ask for their advice. Say, hey, I'm thinking about the energy industry. Who can you connect me to? Always make that connection. And then once you're in the energy industry, the hardest challenge for veterans that I've seen anyway, the folks that we hire, is why are they there? They get in their head about what's my purpose? What am I doing? What's important? It's in your head. And if you can make that connection that Steve talked about, then when everyone else quits and is at home and they're watching their cat videos, you're going to be working. And you're going to be focused. And you're going to be getting better. And you will accelerate through corporate America. Because you'll know why you're there, you'll care about the work, and you'll do it to an extremely high level of expertise. So I think that that connection is so important for all of us, to know why you're there and you have that mission. And the energy industry, the infrastructure, you cannot beat it. Go to any small town that's been hit by a tornado, a hurricane. Who rolls in first? We got to rebuild the infrastructure. Look at any place around the globe where there has been violence, or you got to rebuild the infrastructure. It is the critical path. And you want to be part of that critical path. And you will be in a job and you won't feel like you're making that big of impact, because that's how jobs are. They're not inspiring every day, and you'll have to motivate yourself to make that impact. And if you can do that and connect to that greater purpose, you will accelerate. So I think that's the reason to go into the energy industry.
Anything to add,
Yeah.
Kim? Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I'd say is, I've run a lot of different veteran nonprofits around community building, and usually what we see is veterans do a really good job of networking for like 90 days or so, and then they get their job and they're gone, right? Which is horrible if you sign them up as a year-long volunteer. But then what happens is 3 to 5 years later, they miss the camaraderie, they miss the connection, the community. And once they're stable in their life, but there's just something missing, that's when they really start giving back. The advice I would give is just don't stop. Start before you get out, start taking calls, making time for those things. Even a call a week, year out from separation does tremendous things. And once you get your job, keep going, network internally, network, inside your company, and learn the different people, the different things that are going on. There's a lot to learn, especially at big companies, but and don't be afraid to give back.
Yeah. So we've touched a little bit on what this is and why, and you guys have sort of bled a little bit into how, and I want to ask a few more questions along those lines. How important is, I think Kevin, you touched on this a little bit, but if you're wondering, do I need to get a new degree? Do I need to get an advanced degree? How would you think about that? How important is that coming out of the military?
I mean, what do you want to do when you grow up? Right? That's the key question I always ask. It's kind of funny, but I mean, of anyone at any age, whatever you're doing, you're working towards something. And if you just got to know what that is. And so if you feel like you need an MBA, go get an MBA. If you want to go to Yale, good job, Tim. You do that, right? And those are, you're more doing it for the network than you are the degree, right? So, I mean, I think that it's just knowing kind of where you want to go. I've known people that go get their MBA, then go into project development, which is like, you're knocking on doors like a landman in West Texas. Like, you don't need an MBA to do this. But hey, if the GI Bill paid for it, good on you. So it really just depends on what you want to do, and go find those people who you think are doing those things and ask them their advice and get to know them.
My path was that I went to worked for 5 years, and then went to night school to get my law degree. But by the time I was in night school, I was a terrible night school student. My professors were like, you have to stop asking me to do your job. Because I was like, I have questions about this, wait. And we had real conversations because I knew enough to ask great questions. So I think if you're thinking about whether you're going to go get another degree or not, ask yourself, what kind of student will I be right now? What's my most interesting question that I can really push that instructor on? If you don't have interesting questions, go work for a while, because they're out there. So I think there's a little bit of a, what are you going to get from it? But what can they give you? If you don't have interesting questions, they won't have interesting answers. And now, if you're on the GI Bill, you're good, and if not, you're in debt. So I'd go to work first.
Yeah, it's not bad advice. I would say when you look out into the future and you have an idea of where you want to be, 10, 20 years out, and it doesn't have to be specific, it can be general, right? So it could be, I want to run a company someday, for example. That can inform a decision you make far earlier in your career, and then it's a question of whether or not we have the maturity to make that decision, right? And that's usually what determines whether or not somebody goes off to an advanced degree or whether they don't, is the maturity of the person at the time they make the decision. Sometimes people regret not having done it later on, but if your ultimate goal is to run something someday, is an MBA a good idea? Yeah, it's probably not a bad idea. It's probably a pretty good idea to go think about getting that at one of the top schools, because what that does is it opens a network and it gives you basically a skill set, and that skill set's very valuable. If you want to be a CTO and run things from a technology perspective, go get a master's, go get a PhD even. I know people who've done that. And I guess the one thing that I would just sort of emphasize here too is the future of energy, particularly from a clean energy perspective, has a lot to do with the evolution of technologies that are in their incipients now, right? So all of that has to be developed, all of it has to be commercialized, and that is a non-trivial task. That requires a lot of capital and a lot of brain power and a lot of people who are dedicated to it. And we see people who come out, veterans, who step into those roles as well. So it's pretty broad-based, but I would say that it really comes down to making a decision early in your career based upon what you think you want to be 20 years down the road. And that's hard to do.
And I will say that, well, I guess I'd also ask you to comment on any specific initiatives, any specific programs that can support folks as they sort of make this decision or make this transition.
Yeah, so if you're still in, SkillBridge is a great opportunity. If your command will approve it, 6 months of paid time at no cost to the employer to go out there and get some industry experience. Hiring Our Heroes sponsors a lot of that and runs that. There's a lot of really great job fairs through partners. There's not really that many national veteran nonprofits that are doing workforce transition well. It's a very fragmented market, so you have to look at what area, what vertical that you want to get into, and then kind of work with that. I'm starting to work with a trade group, American Clean Power, and bring together a lot of these disaggregated efforts into a comprehensive workforce development transition program. But I mean, as we have these really high numbers, I think it's come through people, how you came in. They went to the utilities, right? It's a very common work culture to the military. And then if you have any nuclear assets, where are you going to find people with nuclear experience? The Navy. So, I think that there's a lot of luck that's kind of come into driving such a high veteran representation inside of clean energy, but it also aligns with a lot of our drive and motivation. But finding those programs to be really difficult, and ultimately it just comes down to there's this network and you got to plug into it. And I've never seen anyone go, I don't have time to talk to another veteran. Yeah. They may say, I don't have time, so I'm going to introduce them to somebody else. I do that, sorry. But yeah, no, I think it's a great network to plug into most of all.
And I think that's a good point in that even if you go back and get your MBA, even if you whatever path you choose, that networking piece keeps coming up. Before you leave, once you've left, just keep networking because it's the path to connections and actually finding out about different opportunities in general, consistent.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that throughout my career, I think I used a headhunter once. And everything has been through a network. And I'm not a particularly good networker, right? Some people it's like a gift they have. They can go out and walk into a room with 50 people and walk out with 50 new best friends, right? And then they maintain contact with these 50 new best friends. And it's astonishing how some people can do this, but it's a valuable skill to have. And it's something you should always kind of carry with you.
I think the key for networking is asking good questions and being genuinely interested in what other people are doing, what their path has been, what are their challenges, what's going on in their area. So I'm terrible at networking. I'm awful, which is terrible for a chief people officer to say, but I'm terrible.
I'm going to call BS. I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all.
So there are those people that Steve talks about, that's not me, but I am interested. Like when you tell me what's going on, I say, okay, wait a minute, start at the beginning. You woke up this morning, then what happened? Like, I'm genuinely interested, and that's a superpower for networking. So be interested, and then people will find you so interesting.
And don't set up a meeting with someone to ask for a job. Ask for some advice. You might end up with a job, but be humble, be curious. It'll be a fun conversation as opposed to, they stopped talking, now it's my turn. Are they done yet? Because I have something to say. You're actually listening, you're actually engaged, and you don't have to fake it till you make it. You're just really, you're tuned in on the conversation.
Helpful.
Which is what makes you a good networker.
I'm working on my rebranding right now. Excellent.
Okay, what about barriers? What about things for veterans to keep in mind that might be in their heads or might be reality? I know we've touched on, right now the volume of applicants is big. So anything else?
Volume of applicants is big. I also think you got to do your work. Some veterans will show up and that's all the work they've done. I'm a veteran. You say, really, why would you like to work here? And they kind of say, well, why not? Oh, and that's not a good answer. Like, do your research. Find out what the company does, what you're passionate about. Have some good questions coming in. I think that's really important. So veteran gets you in the door, but now you've got to make the sale.
If you've ever told yourself, don't they know who I am? You need to take a pause, take a knee, and think about everything that Mary just said. Because that's what happens a lot of times is you're looking back at your accomplishments. You know, you're looking at the boxes on your CV or your resume. You just spend a lot of time. You're like, who wouldn't want Lieutenant Doffing running, you know, a $50 million company? This is great.
I could do it.
Yeah, I could do that. I don't need time. But I mean, it's not about what you did. It's what you're going to do with that for the company in the future. And if you can't bridge that gap into the future tense of how you're going to translate that experience into meaningful action for the company, you can't convince them of why they should hire you. But if I'm just going to sit around and be like, all right, this one time in Ramadi, I'm kidding you not.
There I was.
Yeah. That's not going to help you in an interview.
Yeah, and people shouldn't be shy. You can't be shy about this kind of stuff either. It's very aggressive, assertive aggressiveness. It's something I would say you have to be successful as you go through a career. And that's in the military too. It's the military or it's the private sector. And you simply translate that to the private sector and continue that because that actually, it yields dividends.
Okay, I want to pivot a little bit. We spend a lot of time on veterans looking for opportunities and what that might look like, but we've also got a lot of employers, a lot of senior folks in the audience and online. What do you want to say to them? Why should they be considering veterans? Is it just a sound business decision? And then also, you know, what should they be thinking about in terms of recruitment and keeping veterans on board?
So I would just say that first, look internal, see what veterans you have internally and talk to them. You know, that they're going to be the best advocates, even if they're not in a direct hire succession or they're not involved in the talent recruitment or vetting process. Just having veterans internal that can review resumes and give advice. Often they'll make time. It's one of the biggest things that veteran employee resource groups want to be involved in is the talent workforce development pipeline at their company. So if you don't have an employee resource group for veterans, if you don't know who are the veterans, I would start there first and see where you're already winning with veterans coming into the company organically.
Yeah, veterans are good at hiring veterans. And I can probably count on less than one hand the number of veterans that I've hired in my career who have failed, right? They tend not to fail. I mean, they tend to succeed. That just seems to be one of the rules.
And I think they tend to stay. If you give them a hard challenge, they will stay until the challenge is complete. And that's incredibly valuable to an employer. You're going to make that investment. You're going to train someone up. You need them to stay and deliver. And veterans will do that.
I'll play devil's advocate on this because I've met employers that refuse to hire veterans. And the reason is they tried doing it with terrible results. There was a company in Houston, a manufacturer of oil field equipment, and you know, very quietly like, listen, we've tried this, it just doesn't work. I'm like, okay, so what happened? Well, we needed welders. Oh, okay, so you hired like NCCR, crosswalk, you know, welders from the military. No, that's a thing? Yeah. There's certified welders in the military. Oh, we didn't hire those. Well, then who did you hire? Oh, we just hired whoever we could. Okay, that's interesting. So what kind of like training program did you put them in so that they could become welders? Oh, we didn't have that. Okay, so you didn't hire for fit, skills, and then you had no like training program in place. Are you good at hiring anyone? Just curious. They're like, yeah, we cherry pick from our competitors. I'm like, you should stick with that. So I mean, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? If you're going to hire, you know, people that you know, and there's an informal onboarding of, hey, we have veteran advocates internally that are making recommendations. That's going to go well. Just we're going to hire a charity case that happens to be a veteran. Good luck.
That's fair. I'm going to peel in a few questions from the audience and also just flag for folks that if you want to ask a question, please send it to askac.org, askac.org. But this is along this topic, so I'll ask, please share tips for veterans to avoid a mismatch in their job search. So this is the other side of that piece.
Do they have a veterans ERG? Do they have veterans in leadership? What are they doing? Not just saying, but what are they doing to support veterans in their community? Those are all, you can find all of that information out. Talk to a veteran who's there. Another way to just make sure it's going to be a good fit.
I mean, same thing if you're a female veteran going in and you see no female veterans, but you see veterans, but you don't see any female veterans in leadership or in the organization, you know, you got to look at that. And I mean, it's whatever your background is, whatever your affinity is, you look for the people that you aspire to be. And if you don't see them there, how well are they valued and promoted?
Sometimes you got to be first.
Ooh, I like
Just
that.
saying.
Well, but there's one other thing to bear in mind with this too, is that it's kind of a stealth network, right? When you look out throughout industry, and I don't just mean energy, I mean all of industry, there's kind of a stealth network out there of veterans that don't necessarily publicize themselves. You can find out who the people in leadership are that were veterans, but when you go down through the organization, chances are if you have people who are veterans in leadership at the top of the company, you got a bunch of veterans at that company because they probably have a program or they at least have a predisposition to hire veterans and know how to do it. So you'll find that out there, and I would argue that it's a far broader network than most people realize.
Okay.
But it's quiet.
There's also the medallions, like you can get the gold veteran medallion, so that'll be on your website. That's an easy one to look for. You can also look for the SkillBridge program. Do they have it? Have they tried it? Because if an employer has that program in there and they've committed to that, or if they're committed to trying it, that sends you a strong signal that they want to have a program to onboard veterans.
Okay. Someone here asks, what are some great areas within the energy industry that former senior officers should consider that they might not normally think about?
I wish there was a nonprofit for O5s. I just feel like that is like a gap in the market. I'm not kidding at all. I mean, like, it is a completely different conversation for O5s that haven't networked and are trying to figure this out. I've been screamed at by an O5 spouse. Do you not know who my husband is? I don't think anybody here does. I don't have that great of advice on it. I think it goes back to even more networking when you're talking about senior level transitions.
I think there's also an element, and I remember this early in my career, I met an admiral. It was a 3-star who actually came over to a company that I was closely associated with. And this was in the technology industry. And I think that the reason he was as successful as he was, very successful, coming in at a pretty senior level, was he was able to actually sort of subjugate his ego, perhaps from the past, and interject a degree of humility, understanding he's walking into something very different than what he had previously. And that was very successful for him, and he actually was wildly successful in the industry. But he was a 3-star who came out and walked into private industry and the technology industry. Doesn't happen too often, right? But he was quite successful in doing so.
I also think you can start at a level and then grow. Just once you come in, you will be able to rise. So I wouldn't get caught up in the level that you start at.
And I'll just chime in to say that, again, from the data perspective, from the clean energy looking out perspective, there's so much growth that companies are going to have to fill very, very quickly. So somebody that from another private sector, from the carpet sector, moves over to the cell industry sector, and within a year or two, they're managing the entire factory. There's just a lot of growth in this area. And so where you start is not necessarily where you're going to be for years and years on end.
I think there's one other thing I'd add to that too, which is when you think about companies, and we talk about clean energy here a lot, every energy company in the US or every company around here is a clean energy company, right? It just has different variations on that theme. So when you talk about oil and gas companies, I guarantee you, every oil and gas company that you know the name of is out looking at things, evaluating things for carbon reduction. All of them are. And they are for 2 reasons. One, there's a regulatory environment that requires it. There are incentives that incentivize it. And lastly, it's the right thing to do. So you're actually going to see this stuff evolve, whether people like it or not, right? And all of these companies are committed to it. So you do see this, and you might think of some of the big oil and gas companies that they're not the right companies to do so. They're not clean energy companies. They're going to drive the clean energy transition, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question from the audience. There are a lot of great veterans hiring resources. Anything negative to watch out for as a hiring manager or a vet looking for a job?
I don't know if you need to pay for a lot of things as a veteran looking to get a job. There's a ton of free services. That's one of the things we've always kind of seen.
Companies hiring welders who don't have any welding practice?
I mean,
That's another one.
you know,
Hypothetically?
hypothetically.
Okay. And this actually goes back to what you were just discussing, but from a working perspective, how long should we look to stay in a role before pursuing internal roles?
It depends on the company. It depends on the challenge. Don't leave the role until you've accomplished the mission in that role. Get something done. You don't want to just say, I was the director of X. You want to say, I was the director of X and we accomplished this, and now I'm moving on. Build your succession plan behind you so that when you hand it off, the work doesn't fall off. It was important work when you were doing it. It's still important work. If you get to the point where you've accomplished the near-term mission, you have a strong succession plan, it's time to move. You don't want to get 1 year of experience 20 times. You want to get 20 years of experience. But the work is important. The company cares about the work. So when the work is in a good place and you have someone to hand it off to, that's when it's time to go.
Yeah, I'd say 99 times out of 100, people don't leave companies, they leave managers. It's the fundamental reason they leave. When you think about it from that perspective, I would have a slight twist on what you say, which is look for the manager that you respect in the company and see if you can end up working for that particular person, provided you go to a big company, you don't do a startup company as an entrepreneur. With that, not only will you have sort of guidance as you move to higher levels in the company overall, but it tends to chart a path if you're in a large company and that's what you want to do. I think it's a little different if you go to the startup world, right, and to the kind of entrepreneurial world, where I think there is an element of aggressiveness associated with moving jobs, and sometimes you end up with 2 or 3 jobs rather than only one. You're hired for one, but you're required to do 2 or 3 or even more. That gives you a lot of latitude to kind of spread your wings a little bit and do other things, but it's challenging. And the last thing I would say on that front is you should always feel like you're in a little over your head. At least that's what I would say, because it's going to force you to reach it a little bit. It's going to force you to learn. And once you do that, people recognize that. And again, when you go back to people leaving bosses and not necessarily companies, the bosses that you would want to work for, they recognize this, right? They typically recognize it even if you don't think they do. And all of a sudden, things tend to work for you as you go through a company.
Yeah. So, I mean, my background was entrepreneurship. So, you know, to Mary's point, you know, I would take up accounts payable and then realize I don't actually know what that means. And then I would buy literally, I bought Accounting for Dummies and I tore through that book a few times, and then I realized what it was. And once I got good enough to know a set of expectations and processes that I built for myself, now I'm ready to hire someone behind me. But I was never hiring anybody to do something I hadn't already become at least familiar with, but always hiring somebody better. And that growth progression, I feel, is somewhat analogous. And yeah, I mean, you know, if you ever run a business, you know the pain of like, oh, I'm going to negotiate this big contract, but the toilet's stopped up. Okay, yeah, we got to do that one. That's urgent. So, you know, you have to juggle a lot of different things. And I mean, I always think of my time in the infantry as the best, you know, training for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing, big companies have training programs. Smaller companies don't. They just don't. So you end up getting tossed into the fire, which is actually a good place to be, right? And veterans team to do pretty well when they get tossed into the fire and are forced to perform quickly.
It's a different kind of training program.
It is, yes. Very different.
You pay attention when it's your money, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would also say look at who your peers are that you're spending time with. Like, we talk a lot about your boss, and I agree with you completely. You have to find the right boss and follow them. But think about who you're spending time with, who are your peers, because that'll become your identity in the organization. We'll see that as you're choosing to be with these folks. That's who you are. It's a little guilt by association maybe, but in the military, you don't get to choose who's in your squad, who's in your platoon. The military decides that for you. But in corporate America, or when you're taking a job, it's a huge decision. It's a huge thing that's important to really think about, and who you're spending time with, who you're supporting, who you're networking with inside the company in those first few years is really important. And often you'll rise together. And that can build some pretty amazing networks too.
So avoid the E4 mafia in corporate America. That's my takeaway.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to pivot again, this time to a little bit along the lines of policy. So E2's perspective, we're seeing a huge amount of opportunity. We've underscored that. All the data shows it. But those opportunities that are happening now, they didn't happen by chance. So what are the policies you're seeing, and what role can veterans play in advancing them?
I mean, I think veterans are a trusted messenger across most of American society. It's one of the last melting pots, purple, nonpartisan issue institutions that people still trust. And so getting out there and expressing your support of these policies is critical.
Just from a pragmatic standpoint, the runway that the IRA gives you to make capital investments long-term is critical. Just from a pragmatic standpoint, if you're going to invest over an amount of time, having that certainty creates significant opportunities. So when you're thinking about policies and what policies to get behind, I would really think about, from a pragmatic standpoint, what's at the heart of the issue that you're trying to solve, how long will it take to solve it, and what are the enablers that you need? And if the policy lines up to that, then you're in a really solid spot.
Yeah, and I guess I'd answer that slightly differently too. That when you think about sort of economic growth and opportunity, you need two things, right? You need credit and you need energy. Those are the two fundamental things you need. Those things go away, you don't really have an economy, at least not a modern economy as we think about it now. So when you think about policy overall, we go back to security, affordability, and sustainability. And policy, at least at the federal level and even at the state level, is really to engender those three things. And it's to try and find an optimal nexus for those three things. Energy being imperative for an economy means the opportunity is always going to be there, although it morphs from time to time. It changes, right? And so you have to be adaptable to that. But I would say that within the energy industry, it's an enormous industry. It has very small companies, it has very large companies, but it's enormous. And it requires an enormous number of people coming in every year to ensure that it continues to function and grow, right? So there's great opportunity. Policy is really that which helps to engender that and move it down a path. Could we move down a path towards sustainability without policy right now? Economics don't really support in many respects. But with policy, it allows economics to support until the policy isn't needed anymore. And sometimes I would say that maybe the policy sticks around too long, right, with incentives, and should disappear as things become more economically viable. And then you actually think about new policy overall. And I think that's the whole process that happens, particularly here in Washington. And it's actually up to companies to help inform that too. So it's actually it's a crucial tool for ensuring that the opportunity remains and grows rapidly.
Well, I'd also just chime in to echo what was said, in that the veteran voice is so powerful on that front, because the credibility that comes with having fought for national and energy security is just, it's nonpartisan, it crosses the aisle, and it's really valuable. So I would encourage veterans to engage whatever career you end up in. Going back to the questions from online, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, recommendations for breaking out of a rut from working under multiple companies, mainly startups, that failed from events out of your control, but show your own personal resiliency, COVID, government changes, etc. How do you sell that to your next opportunity? How do you, yeah.
That can be hard. I've been there. So, I mean, you really just got to focus, to Mary's point on what did you actually accomplish? Not just that you had a C-suite title at a two-person company, that you achieved certain things in the prosecution of building out that company, even if it failed, and being able to talk through those, effectively. I think that's really the thing is, you're now more not on the titles of your CV, but on the accomplishments within those roles.
That's a good answer. We should all go with that.
We're done here, everybody.
I would also say the company doesn't care as much about what you've done before. They care about what you're going to do for them. So bring those lessons forward. Say, I've accomplished these things, but let's talk about what is in this role and how I could impact this role. because it really, that future focus is where the company wants you to be.
And I just say, if you don't learn something from failing, then there's probably something not working right in your head, right? Because you learn a lot from failing. And some of the advice that I try to give, I give my kids, is take big risks with your career when you're young because you can. And it's okay to fail. And if you're confused between an established company or an entrepreneurial event or opportunity you have, think hard about it. But when you're young, you can actually take big risks, and it's okay if that company goes bankrupt or it fails, because what you'll learn from that experience is enormous. And I guarantee you walk into another company and say, here's what happened, here's what I learned, and chances are you'll probably walk out with a job.
Well, that leads me with a couple of minutes to go with, last words of advice, and that might be yours, but any last words of advice for veterans in transitioning?
We haven't really talked about this, but I think networking is important and worth discussing. I just think that, you do yourself a disservice by not tapping into the strongest resource you have, which is this alumni organization of the military. Don't be afraid to reach out across branches, even to the Marines. You can come back and complain to me later about it, but I promise you there's good ones out there. And so I just think that, you got that. So I just think that that's really where you need to be investing a lot of your time up front, and it's an enduring effort that you need to invest into.
And then give back. Get stable and then give back. Be the person who actually will answer the email, the LinkedIn connect them with someone else. Be that person.
Yeah, and I'd say don't expect a straight path, right? I mean, you never quite know where you're going to end up, and circumstance conspires in ways that you can't possibly forecast. And that's with respect to your life and your career. So that's something you have to expect as you go through the years, right? And if you can, when you're young, take risks, right? Or wherever you happen to be in life at that time, because it has to do with the circumstances around your life, the kinds of risks you can take. But when you can take them, I would suggest it's not a bad idea to do so.
Great way to end. I can't think of a better one. So with that, we'll just say thank you. Thank you to ASV for having us, the Atlantic Council, and to all of you for a great discussion.